The morning they burned the schoolhouse door, she was already standing in front of it. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood with her arms at her sides and her chin lifted, and let the smoke curl up around the frame, while 3 men on horseback watched and waited for her to break. She didn't break. She never had. Before we go any further, if you're watching from anywhere in the world tonight, drop your town in the comments below. And if you've ever had someone stand between you and something dark and refuse to move, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, ride with me until the very end, and I promise, you won't forget her. Act 1. The Man with the Badge and the Boy with the Bruised Eyes. Cold Creek, Wyoming. November, 1883. Sheriff Elias Voss had not smiled in 14 months. The town knew it, counted it quietly the way you count days until a storm breaks, and nobody mentioned it to his face because Elias Voss was not the kind of man you mentioned things to. He was 45 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of Wyoming winter. His hair had gone steel gray at the temples the year his wife, Catherine, died of fever in July. The cruelest month to lose someone, all that heat and no mercy. He wore the same brown coat every morning. He drank his coffee standing up, already looking out the window at the ridge like something was going to come down off it, and he needed to be the first to see it. He had a son. Daniel was 14 and had his mother's mouth and her way of going quiet when something hurt too much to say out loud. He was thin and fast and had started hanging around the eastern end of town where the older boys gathered near Cutter's livery at dusk. Elias knew it. He told himself the boy was just restless. He told himself that every father told himself that, and most of them turned out to be wrong, and he pushed the thought back down and went back to his window. Cold Creek was not a dying town, but it was a tired one. The silver had run thin in the Beaumont claim 2 years back, and half the men who'd come for it had stayed because they had nowhere better to go. The church roof needed mending. The general store had changed hands twice. And the schoolhouse at the edge of Maple Street had sat empty for 6 weeks since old Reverend Tillis had packed his Bible and his arthritis and ridden south, leaving 14 children and a chalkboard with nothing on it but the word courage, which he'd written on his last day and seemed, in hindsight, less like a lesson and more like an apology. The town council had sent for a teacher. What they got was Clara Finch. She arrived on the Thursday stage in a dress that had been washed so many times it had gone from blue to something closer to sky. She carried a carpet bag and a crate of books. That was everything. No trunk, no family waiting, no letter of reference from anyone important. Just the books and the girl who held them like they were worth more than luggage, because to her, they were. She was 19 years old, 5 feet and 3 inches. Dark hair pinned up in a way that said she'd done it herself in a moving coach. Her hands were small and calloused. Her eyes were the color of creek water in October, gray-green and still on the surface, but running fast underneath. Elias was on the porch of the jail when the stage came in. He watched her step down and look up at the mountains the way people who'd never seen real mountains always did. That catching of breath, that sudden understanding that you were small and the world was not. But then she looked away, steadied herself, picked up her crate. He told himself she would last 2 weeks. He told himself he'd seen her kind before. Eastern girls with ideals and soft shoes who didn't understand that Cold Creek's mud was different from Eastern mud, that the wind here didn't stop, that the loneliness here was a physical thing with weight and teeth. He told himself all that. And then he watched her walk toward the schoolhouse with that crate of books, and something in the way she walked made him stop telling himself things and just watch. She didn't look fragile. She looked like someone who had already survived the thing that was supposed to break her. Act 2. What the mining camps make. Clara Finch had not always been called that. She had been Clara Nothing for the first 12 years of her life. The orphan girl at the Beaumont mining camp near Laramie, passed between foremen's wives like a piece of furniture nobody quite wanted to keep. She'd learned to read from a hymn book. She'd learned arithmetic from watching the company store cheat the miners and working backward to find the right number. She'd learned to keep her voice low and her back straight and her opinions behind her teeth, because in a mining camp, a girl with opinions was a girl who got put out in the cold. She had been cold before. She knew exactly how cold it got before it killed you. And she had decided, at 13, sitting in a supply shed with a candle and a water-damaged copy of McGuffey's Reader, that she was going to learn every word in every book she could find, and then she was going to teach every child she ever met, because nobody had done that for her, and she understood, bone deep, what the lack of it cost. She had no mother to write home to, no father whose name she knew. She had calluses and stubbornness and a belief so fierce it bordered on unreasonable, that children deserved better than the life handed to them by accident of birth. That belief had carried her from Laramie to a teaching certificate from a sympathetic school superintendent in Cheyenne, who'd been impressed, mostly, by the fact that she'd shown up 3 days in a row and answered every question correctly and hadn't asked for anything except the examination. And now it had carried her to Cold Creek. She swept the schoolhouse floor her first afternoon, chased out a family of mice from behind the stove, nailed the loose window shut with a stone because she had no hammer, and stood in the empty room with the afternoon light coming in, crooked and counted 14 desks, and felt something very close to joy. The children came the next morning, 14 of them, ranging from 6-year-old Nettie Pierce, who arrived clutching a corn husk doll, to 15-year-old Marcus Webb, who arrived with his arms crossed and an expression that said he'd rather be somewhere he was not being taught. And in the middle, near the back, sat a thin boy with his mother's quiet eyes and a fresh bruise fading green-yellow along his jaw, Daniel Voss. Clara noticed the bruise the way she noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it, did not remark on it. She called roll. She introduced herself. She wrote 3 words on the chalkboard: read, think, question. And then she looked at Daniel Voss in the back row and asked him to read the first paragraph of a passage she'd opened to in the book of frontier geography, and he looked at her like she'd asked him to fly. Go on, she said, not unkindly. He read, poorly at first, stumbling over syllables, his ears going red. But he read. When he finished, she said, good, again, faster this time. He stared at her. You heard me, she said, and something in her voice, not hard, but certain, the voice of someone who has heard too many people say you can't to ever let it land, made him look back down at the page. He read it again. Faster. Better. She nodded once and moved on, and Daniel Voss sat in his seat and stared at the back of her head and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. It felt like being handed a tool he hadn't known he needed. The Harrow boys. The Harrow gang had come to the county the previous spring. 8 men led by a man named Cole Harrow, who wore his hat low and spoke in a voice like gravel in a tin can. They weren't outlaws in the traditional sense. They didn't rob banks. They recruited. They found desperate men, men without work, men with debt, men whose wives had left and whose pride had curdled into something mean and directionless. They found boys especially. Boys like Daniel Voss, who was 14 and angry about his mother and tired of his father's silences, and who didn't yet understand that men like Cole Harrow offered a kind of belonging that cost everything you were. They'd set up at a camp in the hills east of Cold Creek and had begun, quietly, systematically, to make themselves necessary. They bought up a miner's debt. They paid a widow's back rent. They appeared at town meetings and sat in the back row and said nothing and let their presence do the work, because men who carry guns don't have to make speeches. Elias Voss knew what they were. He'd seen their kind before, in 2 other counties, in 2 other towns. He'd sent a letter to the county marshal 3 weeks ago and received no reply. He watched his son walking the east road at dusk and felt something tighten in his throat that he could not name and could not fix. He was one man with a badge in a town of tired people. He did not know yet that the school teacher had also seen their kind before, that she had grown up in camps where men like this ate first and left the bones, that she recognized the Harrow boys the way you recognize a type of weather before it arrives, by the smell of the air and the way the birds go quiet. The first time one of them came to the schoolhouse, it was a Tuesday. He leaned in the doorway during the noon hour while the children were eating their lunches, a big man, one of Harrow's, with a Confederate silver buckle on his belt and eyes that moved over the room like an inventory. "Fine little school," he said. Clara was erasing the morning's lesson from the board. She turned slowly and looked at him. "School's in session until 3, she said. "If you have a child to enroll, I'll need their name and age." The man smiled. "No children? Just admiring." "Then I'll ask you to admire something else," she said, and turned back to the board. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, low, impressed, and left. Marcus Webb, 15, who had been watching, said, "Miss Finch, you know who that is?" "I do," she said. "He's one of Harrow's." "I know." "Aren't you scared?" She set the eraser down and looked at him. "Of course I am," she said. "Now open your reader to page 43. She was terrified, and she showed none of it, and she would carry that fear the way she carried everything, quietly, in her spine, where it became something other than surrender. Act 3. The Boy in the Cold. She found him 3 weeks into November. Daniel Voss was sitting on the schoolhouse steps at dawn when she arrived, 2 hours before any other child would come. He was shivering. His knuckles were split. He had not been home. Clara stood at the foot of the steps and looked at him for a long moment. Then she unlocked the door and lit the stove and did not say anything about the knuckles or the hour. She put water on for coffee and set a piece of cornbread on the desk in front of him and sat in her chair and opened a book. After a while, he said, "I was going to go with them." She didn't look up. "I know." "How did you know?" "Because you're angry," she said. "And angry boys who don't have anywhere to put it will take the first hand offered. It doesn't matter much whose hand it is." She turned a page. "What stopped you?" A long silence. Outside, the wind moved through the aspens. "I thought about reading," he said finally. "I kept thinking, if I go, I'll stop reading. And I didn't want to stop." She looked up at him then. This thin, bruised boy with his mother's quiet eyes. She thought about herself at 13, in a supply shed by candlelight, about what it costs a child to find the one thing that makes the world make sense, and about what it costs them when it's taken. "Then don't stop," she said. He ate the cornbread. She taught him for 3 hours before the others arrived, and in those 3 hours, she taught him 3 months' worth of mathematics and 2 chapters of history and something else she couldn't put a name to. Something about the relationship between reading and survival, between knowing things and being able to bear your life. She sent him home before the others came. She told him to tell his father he'd been at the schoolhouse. She thought about that conversation, what Elias Voss would say when he heard it. She was not prepared for him to come in person. Elias Voss, at noon. He came at midday, when the children were at lunch, and filled the door frame the way large men do, not aggressively, but inevitably, the way mountains fill the horizon. She looked up from her desk. "Sheriff?" "Miss Finch." He came in, removed his hat, turned it in his hands. "My son was here this morning." He was. He was out all night. He came here just before dawn. I gave him cornbread and let him study. She met his eyes. He needed to be somewhere safe. I don't imagine he had many options. Elias Voss looked at the chalkboard. Read, think, question. He looked at the rows of desks, the books stacked neatly by size, the stove still warm, the room still holding the smell of wood smoke and chalk. He could have come home, he said. He didn't, she said. That's worth thinking about. It landed harder than she'd intended. She watched him absorb it. The tightening around the jaw, the stillness that came over big men when something hurt them, and they had no mechanism for showing it. She understood that kind of stillness. She'd worn it herself. "I'm not criticizing you," she said more gently. "You lost your wife. He lost his mother. You've both been running from the same grief in different directions. It happens." He stared at her. "You're 19, he said. "I am." "Where do you get off?" "I'm an orphan," she said simply. "I've been studying grief since I was 7. I know what it looks like in the people it hasn't finished yet." She set down her pen. "Your son is smart. He's desperately smart, and nobody has told him so. And he was 4 days from riding east with the Harrow gang because he needed somewhere that felt like he mattered." She kept her voice steady. "He matters here. I'd like to keep it that way. With your permission." A long silence. The wind knocked against the window. "You're not afraid of me," he said. Not quite a question. "I'm not afraid of much," she said. "I was raised in a mining camp. You're considerably less dangerous than a cave-in." He looked at her for a moment longer. And then, for the first time in 14 months, something changed in his face. Not a smile, exactly. Something smaller. Something that had forgotten what smiling felt like and was trying to remember. He put his hat back on. "I'll tell him to be here before 7, he said, "if you're willing." "I am." He turned at the door. "Why are you doing this? You don't know us." She thought of the supply shed, the candle, the water-damaged book, the particular loneliness of a child who has figured out that nobody is coming to save them and decides, against all evidence, to try to learn something anyway. "Somebody should have done it for me," she said. He left. She sat in the quiet room and let out the breath she'd been holding since he walked in, and then she picked up her pen and went back to planning the next day's lessons because the Harrow gang, or no, tomorrow, was a school day. Assy 4. The morning they came for the school. December arrived hard, the kind of cold that got in under doors and settled in the joints and made old things ache. The Harrow boys lost 2 recruits. Cole Harrow was not accustomed to losing, and he knew, as men like him always know, exactly where to put the blame. The school had become something, not just a room with desks. In 3 weeks, Clara Finch had made it a place, warm, lit, certain. Fathers who hadn't cared about schooling were dropping their children at the door. Mothers were asking what the children were reading. Even Marcus Webb, 15 and skeptical of everything, had started arriving 10 minutes early. Cole Harrow understood symbolism. He came on a Wednesday before dawn, while the frost was still white on the ground, with 3 men. They didn't break windows. They didn't tip over desks. They built a small fire against the schoolhouse door, just enough to blacken the frame, just enough to leave a message. What they had not counted on was the teacher. She had slept at the schoolhouse that night because the wind had been too bitter to walk home alone across the open field, and she had grown up knowing you don't walk long distances in real cold if you don't have to. She heard them in the dark. She lit the lantern. She put on her coat. And she opened the door and walked through the smoke and stood on the top step and looked at Cole Harrow in the gray pre-dawn light. He had a face like a hatchet and eyes like winter sky, pale and without mercy. He looked at her, this small, dark-haired girl in a coat too thin for the cold, holding a lantern, and he almost laughed. "Go back inside, school teacher," he said. "This is my school," she said. "Not for much longer." "You want to frighten me?" she said. "And I understand that. Men like you need people to be afraid. It's the only currency you have." The lantern threw shadows across her face. Her voice was steady. Not fearless, she would be honest about that later, but beyond the point where fear had any use. "But you miscalculated, because I am not afraid of losing what I have. I have never had much." She looked at him levelly. "And the children in this town have less than me. I will not stand aside and let you take the one thing they have." Silence. Then Cole Harrow's eyes moved from her face to the street behind her, and something changed in them. She turned. Elias Voss was standing 20 feet back with his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, and his face absolutely unreadable. Behind him, 3 other men. Marcus Webb's father, the blacksmith Holt, the miner Connors. Not many, but enough, and standing together. And behind them, at the far end of the street, more lights, more windows opening. Cold Creek, tired and uncertain, getting up early to make a decision. Cole Harrow looked at the sheriff. He looked at the woman on the steps. He looked at the growing line of lamplight along the street. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Probably," Elias said. "Right on." Harrow held for a moment longer, the way a man does when he's calculating what a loss costs against what a fight costs, and deciding which loses less blood. Then he turned his horse and rode, and his men rode after him, and the sound of hooves on frozen ground went east and kept going. Clara let out her breath. She became aware that her hands were shaking. Elias climbed the steps and stood beside her and looked at the scorched doorframe. He didn't say anything for a moment. The cold was enormous and white around them. Somewhere down the street, someone had brought a lantern outside and the light wobbled in the wind. "You stood there alone," he said finally. "I thought someone would come," she said. "You didn't know that?" "No," she said, "but I figured it was worth finding out." He looked at her. In the lantern light, he could see the steadiness of her. The way she held herself, not like someone who was unafraid, but like someone who had made peace with fear a long time ago and learned to walk through it rather than around it. "You could have been hurt," he said. "Yes," she said. "So could anyone who tries to do a right thing in a place that isn't sure it wants to be decent yet." She turned and looked at the scorched frame. "I'm going to need a new door." He looked at the door. "I'll have Holt make it. Heavier this time." She nodded. "Daniel is good with a plane," he said after a moment. "He could help if you'd allow it." She looked at him. In his face, she saw something she recognized. Not softness, not yet, but the first small fracture in a wall that had been up a very long time. The beginning of the thing that happens when someone refuses to be afraid of you and refuses to leave, and somehow that combination undoes years of careful isolation. "I'd like that," she said. They stood in the cold together, looking at the morning coming gray over the mountains, and neither of them spoke for a long while, and that silence was not empty. Resolution: what the town decided. Cole Harrow did not return to Cold Creek. The county marshal arrived 2 weeks later, prompted, it emerged, by a second letter signed by 17 town residents, the first signature being Clara Finch and the second being Elias Voss. Harrow was arrested near the Colorado border on an existing warrant from a different county, and the gang scattered like smoke in wind. The new schoolhouse door was made of pine, solid and heavy, with an iron latch and a window cut into the top half so the light could get in. Daniel Voss planed and fitted every board, working on Saturdays with red knuckles in the cold, and Clara taught him geometry through the proportions of door frames and timber joins, and he never once complained, because he had finally found the particular satisfaction of a boy who understands that he is building something that will outlast him. He was still reading. He would not stop. In February, Clara received a letter from a teaching college in Denver, offering a position and twice the salary and a room with a proper stove. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the stove. The school needed her. The children needed her. And if she was going to be entirely honest, which she was always, with herself, if with no one else, she had begun to understand that this frozen, fractured, uncertain little town had somehow become the first place that had ever felt like hers. There was something else, too. Something in the way Elias Voss brought firewood to the schoolhouse without being asked, and sat sometimes in the back row after the children had gone home and read the books she left open on the desks, and occasionally asked her questions about history and geography, and once, quietly, about whether she thought a man could be a different kind of man than he had been if he decided to be. She had said yes. She had said she believed, without reservation, that the most important thing any person could do was decide who they wanted to be and then work toward it every day, imperfectly, honestly, without stopping. He had looked at the chalkboard, at the 3 words: read, think, question. "Good advice," he said. "I've been writing it every morning since I got here," she said, "partly for the children, partly to remind myself." He nodded. He picked up his hat. He got up to leave, and at the door he paused, and without turning around he said, "I'm glad the stage brought you." She kept her eyes on her lesson plan. "So am I," she said. He left. She sat in the schoolhouse while the last of the afternoon light went copper across the floor, and listened to the quiet of a room full of empty desks that tomorrow would be full again, and felt, for the first time in her life, for the first time since a supply shed in Laramie and a water-damaged book by candlelight, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Epilogue. By spring, the schoolhouse had 22 students. By the following autumn, it had a second room built on the east side, with windows that caught the morning light. Clara Finch taught in one room, and a young man named Aldrich, sent down from Cheyenne, taught in the other. She had written to the county school board herself, twice, with the enrollment numbers and a letter that the board chairman described later as the most persuasive document he had received in 20 years of educational administration. Daniel Voss graduated with honors. He wanted to study law. Clara wrote him a recommendation that was 4 pages long and did not once use the word bright, because she believed bright was what lazy people said about children they hadn't bothered to truly know. She wrote instead that he was precise and relentless and fair, and that she expected great things of him, and that she had rarely been wrong. She was not wrong. Cold Creek grew, not large, but steadier, the way places grow when they decide they are worth something. The church got its roof mended. The general store stopped changing hands. People began to say the town had backbone, and some of them knew, though they didn't always say it, that the backbone had arrived on a Thursday stage in a dress worn down to sky color, carrying a crate of books and a belief so fierce it might as well have been made of iron. As for Elias Voss, the stern, gray-templed, window-watching sheriff who had not smiled in 14 months, he smiled by December. He smiled for good by March. And in April, when the aspens came back and the creek ran cold and fast with snowmelt, he asked Clara Finch a question that had nothing to do with law enforcement or town business, and she answered it, and Cold Creek had a reason to set out a good table and hang lanterns in the street, which it did, with considerable enthusiasm, on the first warm Saturday of that year. They said afterward that the whole town showed up. They were right. Some things are worth celebrating. Some things, a school that stays open, a boy who finds his purpose, a town that chooses to be decent, a woman who stood in the smoke and did not move. Some things deserve the lanterns and the table and every single person in the street, because courage is not the absence of fear. It never was. Courage is knowing what matters enough to be afraid for, and standing in front of it anyway. Clara Finch knew that before she ever arrived. Cold Creek just had to learn it from her. If this story found you tonight, if it reminded you of someone who stood their ground when they had every reason not to, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you don't miss what comes next from the frontier. Until then, keep reading, keep thinking, keep asking questions. Ride on.